Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to our second panel of the day on foster care abolition and surveillance of families in the child welfare system. We are so happy you're here. I am especially thankful to our panelists for being here, who I will introduce in a moment. My name is Lindsay Greer. I am a second year law student at Penn Law, and I'm a toll public interest scholar. And I'm just excited that you all are here. In her acclaimed book, Shattered Bonds, Dorothy Roberts wrote, "If you came with no preconceptions about the child welfare system, you would have to conclude it is an institution designed to monitor, regulate, and punish poor Black families." Here's what we know. Black children are placed in foster care at twice the rate of white children. Black children are more likely to be in foster care placements than receive in-home services, even when they have the same characteristics and issues as white children. And Black children are less likely to be reunited with their families after being removed. Here's what else we know. A system built on and entrenched by systemic racism does not have to be the reality. It is possible to reimagine a world in which families of color are not subjected to state surveillance and punishment at disproportionate rates. We can support families instead of separate them. This panel presents a chance for us to talk about the reality of the child welfare system's disproportionate impact on families of color. How did we get to this particular moment? What are the experiences of parents within the system, and how can we reimagine these systems for families and build out true safety and support? To answer these questions, we're so lucky to have our panelists today. Dorothy Roberts is an acclaimed scholar of race, gender, and the law. She is the 14th Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the departments of Africana Studies and Sociology and the law school, where she holds the inaugural Raymond Pace and Sadie Turner Mossel Alexander Chair. She's also founding director of the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society in the Center for Africana Studies. Her path-breaking work in law and public policy focuses on urgent contemporary needs in health, social justice, and bioethics, especially as they impact the lives of women, children, and African Americans. Her major books include Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare, and Killing the Black Body: Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. She's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, as well as a co-editor of 6 books on topics such as constitutional law and women in the law. Many of us at Penn Law and on this call have been so lucky to have Professor Roberts as a teacher and as a mentor, and I personally am just thrilled that she is here. Kathleen Creamer is the managing attorney of the Family Advocacy Unit at Community Legal Services, which uses a holistic family defense model to help parents involved with the child welfare system maintain custody of or reunite with their children. She joined CLS staff as an attorney in the Family Advocacy Unit in 2006. Kathleen has also served as Director of Legal Services at Our Place, DC, which is a holistic reentry program for incarcerated women. She's the recipient of the 2011 Women's Way Unsung Heroine Award, and was recognized as a 2012 Legal Intelligencer Lawyer on the Fast Track. Joyce Mcmillan is a thought leader, advocate, activist, community organizer, and educator. She leads child welfare family engagement advocacy efforts at Synergia Inc. Prior to that, she was program director at Child Welfare Organizing Project, where she organized the community and educated around restorative practices to empower, affirm, transform, and heal communities of color that have been traumatized by systemic injustices. Joyce is one of the nation's leading advocates around foster care abolition, and she recently led a wildly successful rally on Martin Luther King Day calling for the abolition of administration of children's services in New York. So congratulations, Joyce, on that success. Erin Miles Cloud is the co-founder and co-director of Movement for Family Power, which is an organization focused on disrupting and curtailing foster system pipelines to reduce the level of harm inflicted by forced family separations. For nearly a decade, Erin was a family defense attorney at the Bronx Defenders, where she worked to defend parents in their battles with child protective services. Erin writes this on her website, and I think it's a perfect segue into our panel. She says, like many others, CPS became involved with my family. Also, like many others, I have not seen this system heal or protect my family members. Erin calls for, quote, radical shifts in thinking and policy that may give us the possibility to be better, do better, and end the punishment and policing of families. So before we begin, I just have a quick housekeeping announcement. A couple things. If you have a question during this event, please submit it to the Toll Public Interest Center through the chat function, and then we'll answer questions during the last 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. And if you are looking for CLE credit today, please note that we will announce CLE code words 3 times during this event. So you should write down these code words and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to this form was emailed to you, but if you did not receive the email, you should also find the link in the evaluation form on the chat function. And these codes will tell us how long you attended. So your first code word today is END, E-N-D. The first CLE code word is END, E-N-D. So we are going to jump right in. Professor Roberts, I would love to start with you. You know the statistics. In New York alone, more than 94% of reports made to child protective services are called against people of color. You know that Black children make up 14% of the child population in America, but a quarter of the kids in foster care. The statistics are staggering. Can you just tell us a bit about what led us to this moment and why it is that Black children are significantly overrepresented in the foster care system?
Sure. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I am so proud of you, if I may say that, and thrilled about this panel that you've organized. I can't tell you how excited I am to be with these champions for justice and with families and for abolishing this family policing system. I've got goosebumps. It's so exciting. So to kick off talking about the high rates of involvement of Black families in the so-called child welfare system, what many of us are calling family policing or family destruction, family regulation. I would just add to the ones that you stated that half of Black children in America will be subjected to a child protective services investigation at some point growing up. And as you pointed out, at every single stage from there, Black families are more involved, grossly disproportionately involved. So how did we get here? Well, it would take all day to discuss that, but I'll just point out some of the factors which are political, ideological, and legal. First of all, the very purpose of the US so-called child welfare system, CPS and foster care, is to police and punish and destroy the most marginalized families and communities in America. It has always been that purpose from its very inception in the 1800s. And it is a way of regulating families who struggle the most under conditions of unequal racism and capitalism in our society. So it addresses their needs and problems that result from structural economic and racial inequality by taking their children away or threatening to take their children away instead of changing society. And that's why politically, Black families are so much at risk for being involved. In fact, the disproportionate number of Black children should tell you that the purpose of the so-called child welfare system is oppressive, because it would be unbelievable to have a system in the United States that we know has been structured to support white supremacy, to have a system that disproportionately involves Black people, and it's a good system, it's the best system. That's one reason. The second reason is that family policing is based on an ideology that falsely blames family struggles on parental deficit. So it pretends that the reason why families have needs, unaddressed needs, are because of bad parents instead of because of social inequality. And so it incorporates these longstanding racist stereotypes about Black parents, especially Black mothers, that we pass down a depraved lifestyle to our children. We're neglectful. We are prone to drug addiction and violence. And really importantly, that we don't love our children, that there isn't the same kind of loving, caring bond between Black mothers and their children as there are between in other families. And so therefore, Black children are better off in state care than with their own families. And I have heard this explicitly stated at conferences and in family court. You see over and over how decisions about whether to investigate families and take away children are so deeply influenced by this profound devaluation of the relationships between Black children and their families. And then I know we're going to talk about this later, about the legal definition of child maltreatment, which conflates neglect and poverty. And Black children, again, because of structural racism, are more likely to grow up in poor neighborhoods that are policed by CPS. So just to sum all of it up, in a nutshell, racism fuels why we have a family policing system. It fuels how it's defended as a way of saving children from bad parents, and racism determines how it operates. And those are the broad reasons why Black families end up so involved in the child welfare family policing system.
Thank you, Professor Roberts. I personally have learned a lot from the way that you frame it as this political question, and that we cannot separate the issue of racism from how the system operates and how it just continues to fail parents and children over and over again. Joyce, I'd like to move to you, if that's okay. We heard Professor Roberts talk about this devaluation of relationships between parents and their children. I know you have been involved with the what we would call either child welfare system, child policing system, child regulation, family regulation system. How have you personally, and or with the families that you've met along the way, how have you seen, in particular, Black mothers traumatized by their involvement with the system? And how have you seen that kind of impact parents as you've done your organizing on the ground?
I see Black parents, Black mothers being impacted the same way the community watches openly communities being traumatized by the police. The dishonesty, the setup for failure, all of the things that we see happening live on TV, a Black man being choked out for 9 minutes, that's pretty much what's happening in the child welfare system, while they're using some different tactics to accomplish the same goal. What I find is families are in a worse position when child welfare, as some would like to call them, enters a family's life. The family spirals down. Black mothers, especially single mothers in the communities that are overrepresented by child welfare, already have certain struggles. And when the agents come in, they highlight those concerns or those struggles in a way to utilize it against the family and to create more harm and more damage. So I would say, utilizing myself, when CPS came into my life, they didn't protect me or my children from anything. When they came into my life, I had a 9-year-old daughter in private school, a newborn, a job, a car, a credit score, a place to live, and all of those things. And when they left, I had never been involved in any system. And once they came into my life, I ended up incarcerated, homeless, and addicted to a substance, because at that point I needed a substance just to get through the day. And so how did they protect anyone? How did they help?
I think that's a great point. And I think a lot of parents are asking that question. And that's one of the most common things I hear is a system that's called Child Protective Services. What is it doing to protect our families?
Protecting children from success.
I think that's a great segue. Erin, if I could turn to you, your organization, Movement for Family Power, has called for abolition of the foster care system. We just heard Joyce talk about the connection between Child Protective Services and the police, how much worse a family's life can be after child welfare enters into that family's life. Can you talk a little bit about how the foster care system is linked to the carceral state and why reform is not enough? We have a lot of people pushing for reform of the system. Why, in your view, is reform not going to cut it?
Good morning, everyone. And I am so happy to be here today. I got my lipstick on and everything. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling from Lenape land. And if you can't see me, I'm a light-skinned Black woman with a very graying afro and a yellow shirt. I'm going to talk to you a little bit why CPS is a part of the carceral state. I mean, one really kind of common theme when we talk about carcerality is the design of the system, right? So the system was designed to control and contain communities of color and poor communities, and also is a system that causes a lot of harm. So I think when you analyze carceral systems, you say, like, was it designed to actually heal, or was it designed to contain and control? So like the prison industrial complex, like the immigration system, all of these were designed not to meet root issues, but to control, contain, and exploit. And as I've learned from Joyce, huge hat tip to her, is that it also parallels our system of mass incarceration. It prioritizes compliance over healing, the nonprofit industrial complex over community control. It reinforces, creates, and entrenches a culture of punitive imagination, disciplinary tactics, all while hoarding the resources that we actually could be using to thrive, right? And reform is just simply not enough. Our families need support, not surveillance and separation. We need to dismantle and divest from systems that cause harm, that do not offer healing. And reform doesn't do that. It does not grab at the root. It presupposes the very premise that we are trying to uproot, right? It says, hey, I am the family regulation system. I can keep you safe. It makes that as the underlying principle when you reform something. So you have to agree that this is a system designed to keep people safe for reform to actually work. If we agree that it's not doing that thing, it's really impossible to change it, right? And anyone who cooks knows this, right? You have a bad batch. Once you have a bad batch, you can't just stir it a little bit more and add a little bit of something in it. You got to throw it away. And so what reform does is it really stops our ability to innovate. It dulls the potential of imagination. And so abolition, as we achieve it, it creates actually new opportunities for support rather than expanding, that bad batch, that very system that is damaging our system, that again is designed to contain, designed to control, and designed to reinforce disciplinary tactics in a world where we really want to heal, thrive, and have joy.
That is beautifully said, Erin. Thank you for that. I wish that I had a system that I could just have written all of that down as you were going. But this is recorded so people can go back and replay that later. It was beautiful. Kathleen, kind of going off that, Erin was talking about how, the system is not designed to keep families safe. Can you talk about, in your role as an attorney, how you see parents being denied of their basic rights as you are working with them to navigate this system, and how you see kind of the reinforcement of the culture of punishment and surveillance that Erin just talked about.
Thank you so much. I share all the panelists' joy and delight at being here. I just love this conversation, and I can't be more grateful to be in a room with these leaders. I kind of am pinching myself right now. So I have been working with primarily Black moms my whole career, and not actually working with them, working for them, and listening to them for my whole career. And what I can tell you for sure is that moms involved in the child welfare system love their children every bit as much as every parent in this room loves their own children. And their children love and need them every bit as much as every one of your children do. And when we separate a family, that is experienced by both the parent and the child as torture. We saw the kind of expansion of our moral imagination as we saw the family separations at the border. I was grateful for that. I was grateful for the conversation about the impact of family separation on parents and children. I was disappointed to see the mass domestic family separation happening every day in the child welfare system, largely excluded from that. And I think it's really important because having spent time in the system, it's really important to understand not only do parents and children experience family separation as torture, it works out really poorly for them. I'm somebody who loves children. If you told me, don't worry, we're going to torture a bunch of people, but it's going to turn out great, we're going to get great outcomes from it, maybe you could persuade me. I doubt it, but maybe. But what we know is that actually a large number of the people that I represent in family court today are themselves products of the child welfare system, and that foster care has very negative outcomes. So if you look at study after study after study about the outcomes of foster care, you see that it is by and large a significant and lifelong harm to inflict upon a child. Happy to refer anyone to that research, but it's out there, trust me. So I want to just talk a little bit about what that means for my practice and what that means for our approach in the Family Advocacy Unit at Community Legal Services. We are a small shop. We have a small holistic model. We have 8 attorneys, 3 social workers, a peer advocate who lived through the system herself, and 2 paralegals. And what we know about having listened to Black moms our whole careers really guides what we do when we interact with the family. And it starts with the understanding that every family separation is a crisis, and that if you want to help a child, you must start with her mother. So we take it all hands on deck. Just for those who aren't familiar with us, we represent about 10% of the parents in the child welfare system. When we see a family separation, it's an all hands on deck. It's an emergency approach that we take. And while I know that this work is not the very necessary work of visioning and abolition, and I really can't wait to get to some of that conversation, right? We have an urgency, we share an urgency in our work of shrinking the footprint of the system today. So just to give you an example of what that looks like for our clients, I'll tell you 2 stories from January of 2021. One Thursday in January, a mother of some children called us and said that her landlord had an order to evict her and was coming by at 2 p.m. on Friday to take her children. And she called her agency worker, and they said, okay, well, we'll be by, the landlord was going to evict her from her home. I'm sorry. Landlord had an order saying that he was going to evict her from her home at 2 p.m. on Friday. And she called her agency worker, and the agency worker said, okay, well, at 2 p.m. on Friday, I'll be by to get your children. And so we actually are in an eviction moratorium in Philadelphia right now. So our staff attorney got on the phone with our housing social worker and resolved that quickly by Friday morning. And the landlord had agreed to not go forward with the eviction. So those children are with their mother. Also in January, I was over in court handling cases, and I encountered a mother. I was representing a mother who herself grew up in the foster system and had given birth to a substance exposed infant. She had identified a mother-baby placement that she wanted to be with her babies. And I said to the DHS worker, why haven't you considered placing this family together in a mother-baby instead of in foster care? And the answer was, because she's on drugs. And I said, well, you know that the prerequisite to get into a mother-baby system is that you are on drugs. And so fortunately, there is a little bit of a sea change happening in Philadelphia right now that I'm very grateful for. Our courts and our agencies are starting to recognize more and more the harms. And so I'm winning more and more of these cases. So I won that case and that mother got to keep her baby. But I hope those cases kind of illustrate to you one thing that I think is a big misunderstanding about the child welfare system, which is that children are being placed in foster care because they're being physically and sexually abused by their mothers. I can count on one hand the number of times I've represented those kinds of mothers in those kinds of cases. It's extraordinarily rare. So our goal is to shrink the footprint of the system to avoid trauma to parents and children. And we actually, you can look on our website, we started keeping data on our outcomes and we're very, very good at it. We found that in our cases, we prevail in 25% of our initial trials, which means we have those within 10 days. So that means for 25% of families, they're done with DHS in 10 days. We also get kids home twice as quickly as other families in the city of Philadelphia. So our time to reunification is 4 months. City of Philadelphia's time to reunification is 9 months. And our kinship rate, so we know if families have to be separated, they should be placed with someone, children should be placed with someone they already know and love. Our kinship rate is near 80%. So, and then also I want to note that we were trying to keep data on our terminations of parental rights, which I hope that we get to at some point because it's a very severe consequence of this work. And our termination of parental rights rate is so low that we felt like it was perhaps statistically not reportable. Because we're like, is this right? Like, wow, given what we know about the family separation system. So again, I'm thrilled to be here. I know this family defense work is a small piece of this, but I can tell you that we are very effective at shrinking the footprint of the system.
Kathleen, thank you. And thank you for sharing about your work. I echo your sentiment that I'm eager to get to the phase of the conversation of abolition and figuring out what that looks like. Before doing that, I want to kind of lay the groundwork with one more question and ask if anyone can kind of speak to something that Kathleen, you were just touching on, and how the system uses this term of neglect. So we know that children are often removed and it's this big umbrella of abuse and neglect. And that is why we are told that children are removed from their homes. Can any of you kind of speak to that term neglect and how that might set parents up for surveillance before they've even had a chance to kind of parent their child?
Lindsay, may I please take the first stab at this? Because I was just kind of jumping out of my seat as Kathleen was speaking, because as Dorothy Roberts had said earlier, the political and the ideology and how those come together. And so neglect is just a term we utilize to cover basic everything. It doesn't mean that anyone has done anything wrong. People are not accused of doing anything wrong. Neglect doesn't mean I pushed my child down. It means my child fell, which is absolutely normal. So neglect is them taking normal things and making it into a problem to create surveillance. But I want to go a little further and connect the political thing and how we've used laws and political landscaping and ideology to substantiate this system. First of all, Kathleen spoke about the failing outcomes. We all know that the outcomes are failing, right? But yet we have mandated reporters that are threatened to either report or lose their licensing or their job if they don't. But what are they reporting? They're reporting neglect, because 85% of children in New York are in the system for reasons related to neglect. not to abuse. But when you think about the outcomes, and a large portion of that outcome being the children end up incarcerated in the future, it changes the scope from being just a falsehood of protecting children, but a prerequisite to the prison industrial complex. And as that happens, we have to take into consideration that they say slavery was abolished, except for that small clause in the 13th Amendment, where the only way you can have slaves in this country is through incarceration, which is why incarceration has become mass incarceration and why children are being prepared to be the next generation. And so I just want to clarify that and connect that. It's not by accident, it is by design. And if we take a moment to look at the design and see how it interconnects, we can see it for ourselves. All the things we're hackling about are not things to be hackled about. They're things to encourage us to say, we as citizens of this country will no longer stand for this type of behavior, and it is time that we abolish. Because reform is not going to fix it. As Erin said, if there is a spoiled ingredient in the pot, you can't add other ingredients to make it better. If the structure is racist, if the structure is not working, then there's nothing else we can do to fix it. It must come down.
I would just add to what Joyce is saying. I've learned a lot from colleagues and comrades who've been resisting the prison industrial complex about what is a political term. So in that context, when we're talking about the prison industrial complex, they've been really clear that the word crime and what is criminal is something that is created through many of us as lawyers, as we write it down in statutes and as legislative bodies do. The same is true for the terms neglect and abuse. Unfortunately, they also have human non-lawyer meanings, correct? So it's really important to understand when we're talking about what is neglect and what is abuse, we have to first ask us who's defining what neglect and abuse is. So I would even go further and say we have a vast amount of children that are in this system of allegations of the political term of neglect, which can include things like not having food in your home, using drugs, and parenting very well. And it can also include the political term of abuse. Abuse is not the same as harm when categorized under child services. And this might feel like a lot for people, but I'm going to give you some examples. We have cases where children go to the hospital with a broken arm because they fell down. And the reaction is to call that case in as medical abuse because a hospital calls it in. You have cases in Oklahoma where women have experienced violence in their home. And because they have experienced violence, now they are considered to be abusive of their children. So even as we challenge this system and challenge the separations of the good, the bad parents, we have to be really clear that I'm not coming here just for the political term neglect. I'm also coming here for the political term of abuse. And the reality is that none of that actually addresses harm. None of that actually addresses healing. All that does is create a very, very, very robust, wealthy system that continues to employ a lot of people and not meet any of the needs of anyone in our community.
Can I comment on that? I just think that's so important. And I think that when we do recognize, if you look at the data, it's very abundantly clear that the vast majority of cases are not labeled physical or sexual abuse. But when we do see those cases, I think folks have been misled by the media and understanding what some of those cases actually look like. You can look on our website. We just took a case up to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and won unanimously. DHS we had a case where a mother had her child sexually abused by a family member unknown to the mother. And DHS took the legal position that this mother was presumptively responsible for her child being sexually abused, even in the absence of any evidence that she knew or had reason to know that her child was at risk of abuse. So we lost the trial, we lost at the Superior Court, which is our intermediate appellate court, and we won unanimously at the Supreme Court. So it is really important even when we're talking about that 10% of cases that are labeled physical and sexual abuse, to add context to those cases.
And if I could just add one more point about the politics of this, we've now also begun to talk about how this is a sexist patriarchal system as well, that puts certain expectations on mothers to prevent harm to their children and blames them for harms that aren't even caused by them. And more broadly, what is the biggest harm to children? It's structural inequality in our country. What about the people who are poisoning children? What about police officers who are terrorizing children? What about our policies that are starving children? Those are the harms. And yet, instead of seeing that as the abuse, mothers are being blamed for, especially Black mothers, Indigenous mothers, being blamed for harming their children. So it's not, I think one way to think about this, it's the status of the mother that is seen as neglectful. As Joyce would say, the same kinds of failings that if a wealthy white person did it wouldn't be considered abuse, whether it's physical or neglectful. Let's be honest, a lot of what goes on and is seen as abuse in poor families, poor Black families in particular, happens in wealthy families too, and it's not considered abuse at all. So all of this is tied to the politics of blaming marginalized people for the effects of structural inequality. And it's their status in our society that is what's seen as neglectful, regardless of whether they're actually caused anything or not. That's the politics of it.
Thank you, Professor Roberts, and thank you all of you. Those were, I could not have said any of those things better, so I'm grateful you're the one saying them. Just very quickly, for those seeking CLE credit, midway through the panel, I'm supposed to give you another word to fill out on your digital evaluation form. So again, the form is mandatory. The link was emailed to you, but it's also in the chat. So your second CLE code word is family, F-A-M-I-L-Y. Your second CLE code word is family. You all have kind of teed us up so beautifully, and I would like to transition now to talk about what abolition might look like. In my very short time researching foster care abolition under Professor Roberts, the most frequent question I get from people when I tell them that I'm researching foster care abolition is, what are we going to replace foster care with? So I'd like to kind of address that question, ask how you all respond to that question, but then ask, perhaps more importantly, how can we reimagine these systems for families so that we can build out true safety and support?
What, is no one gonna say anything?
No, I want to hear from you, Joyce.
So for me, I know that it means support through the community, by the community, for the community. 100% of what that looks like is not for me to design, because it's not me alone who's been impacted. I think it will take lots of community conversations to talk about how to structure it. What I know, right, while I don't know exactly what that would look like, I know what I also know is we've been doing what's happening for decades, and it's not working for families and the community, and it's not by the community. And I also know partnerships with the devil is not ever going to get us there. That is the weakest form of reform. That's like the bottom level reform. So I'll give an example that last night I received a link from a parent, and she was like, hey, Union Settlement is gonna have this great call with ACS on Zoom. You should jump on. And I'm like, who wants to hear from ACS? And then I looked at the details a little more closely, and there's a grant by Kellogg's, $9 million over a point of 9 years. They were collecting information from the community to help them write this grant. But the call was structured by ACS. how do you think the questions were being asked? The questions were not asked in a way where we would get real answers and solutions. The questions was asked, what services would you prefer? Not if you want services, right? So now people are struggling to answer what they've asked instead of just simply saying to them, we don't want services, can you ask something else? So I did. I disrupted that meeting last night, and I am so damn proud of myself. They were too done with me. But this is an example of how the system utilizes the community in the name of partnership to keep the same behaviors going continuously without any change. And they have a way of making people feel, because they're in the room with them with their power, that they too have power. Kind of like me being on this panel with these great women. I feel elevated, right? Because somehow I was able to enter this room and be a part of their conversation. So ACS or CPS across the states utilize that power for people to feel their power and think somehow some of it belongs to them. But really, they're just going along and getting along and helping them to design things that will keep in place what's already existing. Why do we need any CPS office to sit with us to write a grant to say what they should look like later on and how we're going to use the money to fix them? Really?
I 100% agree with what Joyce is saying about co-governance, right? You can't co-govern with a prosecutor, you can't go co-govern with ACS. That's just not gonna really get us to freedom. And I wanna just reiterate the question, right, Lindsay? The question is, oftentimes we get this question, what are we going to replace foster care with? And I want to just like sit in that question. And I want to just, for the 304 participants on Zoom, if you're not like multitasking like I normally do, I want to reflect on whether or not that's your question. If you are listening to these panels and saying, well, what do I replace it with? I want to encourage two ways to think about that question. One, why is that the first question, replacement? And is that potentially a symptom of carceral systems to create a binary, right? Like, I want another system for the system. Or oftentimes we hear, well, I don't think defund police is a good enough like statement or a slogan. I don't like it, right? I wish you did something else. It was like, well, okay, but what are you gonna build? Do you have a problem with moving and divesting from racism? Or are you saying, actually, I kind of like police. I actually am worried. It's your core need that you're worried that if you let go of the system, you might be unsafe. We might be unsafe, right? And I just really want to just take some time and then reflect, well, who taught you the system was making you safe or anyone safe? And then I think there are people who ask that question because we're taught to ask the question of replacement versus saying, well, how do I build? What is the next conversation I need to have? And I think for some people, that's a really real conversation, right? Like, I can't tell you how to replace and how to make you safe in your community. What I can say is that I am here till my dying day to live in collective liberation and struggle to build real safety, which I do not believe lives in these systems. And that is what abolition is. It is a positive experiment in building something new and safe. We also will make mistakes. So if you see me 5 years from now, and you're like, well, this XYZ thing that we did in collective struggle didn't work. I'll be like, yeah, you know why? We've given white men power for 200 years to make so many mistakes. Shout out to slavery, big mistake, right? And yet we still keep them in power. So it's collective, sustained struggle. And I invite us to really rethink, not how do I replace it with another system, but what are you going to do today to build another conversation to build collective liberation? And I really want to be a part of that.
I would love to comment. I'm so grateful for the energy and the labor that I see on this panel. And I'm also aware that there are people in child welfare who don't mean to harm. They think that they are helping. Their story is one of coming in and helping families. And And I was actually reminded of this poem recently, and I just want to read it to you because it feels so critical when we think about how we talk about the helpers. This is by Lucille Clifton. You guys, I got to drive her in my car once in college. She's amazing. It's called, Why Some People Be Mad at Me Sometimes. They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their stories. And I keep on remembering mine. And so I challenge the helpers in this room, in this virtual room, to ask whose story you're remembering. And are you remembering the stories of the people you helped? And are you critically analyzing and interrogating, did it feel like help to them? So I'm calling on everyone in this room to expand their moral imagination beyond their role as a helper.
Well, everybody had such important and insightful things to say. I would only maybe highlight some of what others said. I think it's, I get that question all the time too, all the time, whether it's in conferences or lectures or just talking to, people about this work. And it's a question that we get about abolishing policing, abolishing prisons. And the first point, I think, is that others have made is that what we're doing now is harmful. It's not only not working, it's causing more harm. So why hold on to something that we know is really devastating to people? It's doing the opposite of what it claims to do. But also that, again, I'm just emphasizing what others have said, that abolition is about building something different, radically different, so that we don't need to rely on these systems and services that are so damaging. That's central to what the work we're doing is, to create a better way. Again, I liked what Erin said earlier, that holding on, just relying on reforms dulls imagination and innovation. This is true in so many areas of radical change, that if you're not willing to work toward it, you're actually hindering a better world. That is what we should all be striving for. And then also, as Joyce emphasized, we have to, it's a process. It's a collective process. We don't have the answers. How could I would be the most arrogant person to say, here's the answer. No, what's important to me is working with the people right here in this panel today. And I've just been honored and humbled to be able to work with each of you to figure this out. But we're committed to it. And that's also what's important. And I want to say to Kathleen that, you said earlier that family defense is just a tiny part, that it's just shrinking the footprint, that it's not really about abolition, but let's talk about reimagining. I think that is part of it. As Joyce also pointed out, we have to mitigate in every way we can the harm that's being done now. And so it's all of this. It's shrinking what's going on now, the footprint and the power of the system that exists now in every way, without collaborating, as Joyce has emphasized, and building something radically different that truly makes us safe, that truly supports families and children, that truly values human beings equally. And that's what abolition is about. And I agree with Erin, if you don't want that, really think about why that is. What's holding you back? That's the question, not, what are we going to replace it with? I think the bigger question is, why wouldn't you want something different when you know that what we have now is rooted in racism and sexism and capitalism and is harming so many people, causing so much suffering? Let's stop the suffering and build something that is humane
And I just want to go back for a quick second. When we talk about protecting, if your job is to protect children, why do we only protect children from a select group of people? Why do we only protect children from parents? I haven't heard CPS being involved with the officer in Rochester who maced the little black 9-year-old the other day as he yelled at her, "You're acting like a child." And she, a child, is telling him, "Hey, dude, I am a child."
Mhm.
But they maced her anyway. A group of officers together could not come up with anything better than macing a 9-year-old child. If that is not abuse, you tell me what is. But CPS will say it is not their responsibility to protect that child. If I'm out to protect children, I protect children regardless to who's causing the harm.
That's, that's one of the excuses that you just said, Joyce. Another one, which I'm sure we've all seen in court, is, well, I don't have jurisdiction over that, or I don't have those resources. So, it was great with Kathleen, what you were able to do to prevent that eviction. But as you know, and many judges will say, well, I can't prevent an eviction. I'm a family court judge. So the only solution is to take the children away.
And
And so go on, Joyce.
no, and what that says to me when we limit how and who we protect children from is that we are purposely seeking to go after those who we can gain custody from, because it is having those kids in their care, custody, and control that's bringing in the federal dollars. It's having those children that's creating the outcomes to be the next generation of slaves. It's having those children that's doing ...
Yeah, I know, Lindsay, you're probably going to ask us about, so I hope it's okay to jump into this financial aspect of it, because that's really important too. It would seem like, how could it be that the state would want to exploit, the most more marginalized people, the poorest people? Why aren't they exploiting the wealthy? Well, because the wealthy are the ones in control of this, but they do extract lots of money from this system, not only from the funds that are pouring, the billions and billions and billions of dollars pouring in to support it, but also from the people who have been caught up in it. So one example is the way in which states take benefits that children in foster care are entitled to, Social Security benefits for disability or for a death of a parent. And they claim that money and use it for whatever they want to use it for. They're not buying the children who are entitled to this money, new clothes or putting them in, in better schools. They're using it to fill up state coffers, just like the prison system does when it extracts all sorts of monetary sanctions and fines and fees from people caught up in the prison system. And so a big part of why this system continues, despite all the harms it causes, is because it's so profitable to not only state and local governments, but also to the corporations that are involved in this. There are corporations whose whole function is to help state child welfare agencies figure out how to extract money from children and families in the system. So that is another important aspect of why this is such an exploitative and racist and harmful system that we have now.
I would love to comment on that. I think it's implicit in everything you're saying and everything everyone else is saying. But when we designed the current system, and as we continue to kind of co-create this system every day, we never listened to Black mothers, and we never asked them what they needed. Mm-hmm. And so again, there are a lot of really well-intentioned folks who are here to help, who really want to help families, really want to help kids, but they almost never spend the time or show the curiosity that they need to show about what Black mothers need. And they will tell you if you ask them, right? You can just go ask them and they will tell you. And you see this kind of replay itself over and over again in what we end up funding. So just to give you an example, there is this growing awareness that foster care is a harm, that we need to try to prevent it. That has come into the mainstream narrative, like, and really honestly, because of the hard work of folks like Dorothy Roberts. But when we've kind of thought about like restructuring the financial incentives around foster care, we came up with the Family First Act. That's a federal act that says we're going to spend some money that maybe would have been spent on foster care on what we call services to prevent family separation. However, that bucket of services that is funded is not the bucket of services that my clients need. So for instance, one of the things my clients can get under Family First as a prevention service is a parenting class. One of the things they can't get is access to housing. So again, it's like, please, I'm calling on everyone in this room to expand your moral imagination to include Black moms and what they are willing to tell you that they need.
But I'm going to go
further than Kathleen. It goes further in the sense that it's not even about asking what we need. Preventive services is a form of surveillance. And when we look at the percentage of Black families, Black mothers, Black children who have already been involved in the system and those who will be involved in their lifetime, then we don't need to expand how we oversee Black families. Why am I not good enough to be a mother to my child, but it's perfectly okay for me to be your nanny?
And I was just going to add, for people that are going into the system, going to work, right? Asking is really a bare minimum.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like the fact that we're in a place right now where we're saying, just please ask Black communities what they want, right? Shows you how far behind and how disruptive and harmful this system is. When Kathleen talks about Family First, it is considered to be like a huge change for the system to just feed itself more money on another side of the system, right? All they said is we are going to spend a little less money on our like foster care agencies, our removal apparatus, our termination apparatus, and give a little bit more money to the things that like really no one's really asking for. But, and all it did was essentially like you have a bank account, you have a checking and a savings, and it says, I'm just gonna put like 2 of those dollars into that other account. It didn't say I'm gonna pull that money out and give it to a community. And I think when we're talking about change, we have to be talking about power building. How are we going to not just listen to Black people, but fund Black people? Like unrestricted, hands off. When we're talking about real change, okay, you're saying, well, I actually don't have any money. Well, you have hands, you have resources, you may be able to type a spreadsheet, you may be able to type something up. How can you then use the resources that you have to give that to people? Do you work in a building and have access to a room? Well, we're in a global pandemic, so maybe not that helpful, but let people meet there. Do you have a Zoom account? Give it out. Do you have an extra hour a week to support writing a grant for someone? If we had the 294 people on this call using both their resources, talent, time, and skill to actually service Black and Brown communities, we could do much more than something like the Family First Act, which just shifts money from one side, which is considered a radical shift. I'm not going to take away the very hard work that insiders did to do that, but that's not freedom.
It's a perfect example of reform that exists within the same structure and not abolishing the structure and imagining something that's radically different from it.
Yes, we're getting a lot of questions in our chat about mandated reporting. So I'm hoping we can just touch on that. We have a little over 15 minutes left, but you're all talking about kind of this reimagining and what it takes to go from only being able to picture the system that punishes and surveils. Can you talk a little bit about how mandated reporting plays into that system? And then several people have also been asking, I'm a mandated reporter in the system. How can I work within the system in my current role in an abolitionist way? So just kind of take that however you would like.
I can say some basic things about mandated reporting, and I'm sure others have more to say about it as well. But Mandated reporting is seen as one of the chief, and it's used as one of the chief ways of bringing abused and neglected children to Child Protective Services so they can be protected from harm. That's how it's promoted, and it fits into everything we've been saying about how the system is about policing families, investigating families, and punishing families. And it turns everyday people into agents of the state to promote the system. It deters people from trying to get the services that are available, because if they know they're going to be reported, if they seek any kind of help, and we know that people are investigated, reported, their children taken away because of needs that they have, then of course people will be reluctant to seek any kind of assistance for their needs if they're going to be reported by these mandated reporters. We also know that mandated reporting is just filled with all sorts of racist and sexist biases. An example of that is the mandated reporting of babies exposed to drugs. That has long been known to be racist against Black mothers. Black mothers are many times more likely, every study that's looked at this, to be reported for drug use during pregnancy, even though we know that drug use during pregnancy occurs across racial and class lines. And so those are just some of the reasons why many of us see mandated reporting as very similar to policing in the law enforcement context, and is a way of continuing a punitive carceral approach to families' needs, and actually is a way of interfering with communities' ability to address families' needs.
I want to apologize for this statement up front because I'm about to piss a couple of people off.
I have that for you, Joyce.
I have no empathy for mandated reporters. And I am so annoyed with mandated reporters in that question. They want me to make them feel good for doing the harm that they are doing. And I'm not going to do that. You have a choice whether or not to make that call. You make that call because there are things more important to you than the children you claim to care about. You know that the outcomes for the children who enter that system and become involved in that system are not good outcomes. But you make that call because you feel like you're protecting yourself. It is a selfish thing that you're doing. It is not to help a child. And I'm just going to tell you, don't look to Joyce Mcmillan for sympathy. How do I maintain and do my job if I have to make this call? You have a right not to make the call. And when your employer comes to you, you have a right to say, I didn't reasonably believe it was a reason to make the call. You are only responsible to make the call if you reasonably believe that there's a call that needs to be made. So stop. Raise your hand if you're mad at me.
And the fact that, and we know that's true, Joyce, because we know that people do not report everyone. They don't report wealthy white mothers who use drugs during pregnancy. They report Black mothers. And so they're making a choice. And
Absolutely.
They make the choice based on racist and sexist ideas, so.
It's like the white news report who asked the Black mother whose son was killed by the police officer, do you forgive them? Are you asking me to forgive you when you make those calls against my children in the school system, the hospitals, and everywhere else that we find you? No, I don't forgive you. You created massive harm. Forgive yourself and don't do it again.
I'm with you, Joyce. I'm going to kind of go back to that framework about why we're always asked, what are you going to replace it with? We're asked this question around mandated reporting because I think some people are asking us to tell you how to do it better. And I actually stopped doing a lot of trainings around mandated reporting because what I found, what people really wanted to know was, what are better ways for me to report? What are ways to make me feel better when I put this report in? And what I'm asking people to do is, one, believe that you do not have to report. And It's a statute, which means it is just, it's a place where people, lawyers, legislators just wrote down that you had to do it. And I'm not saying that there aren't real life consequences for some people, and especially people who are more proximate to communities that are directly impacted, or people who have experience impact themselves. What I'm saying is that there can be mass resistance. There can be lobbying to eliminate reporting. That truly is an option. And I think it would be very successful organizing if people who didn't want to report, that were in a position of mandated reporters, organized to get those laws off the books, right? It would, and you see that with, you're seeing things like mandated reporting is not neutral, which is a collective of social workers in the Northwest. You're seeing, abolitionist social work groups come together. You're seeing, I think it's like SSWU in Chicago, people who don't want to report and also are actively talking about that. And so I think we're going to see organizing, and I'm hopeful that there will be organizing, because I can imagine that someone tells you that harm has occurred and no report is made. And the reason why I can imagine that is because I worked for years in an office where no one reported, because social workers were under the cover of legal ethics, which means all the time you hear stuff and you don't report it. So it's not a leap of imagination. It's happening literally right now. And as Professor Roberts says, it also happens outside of the construct of organizing, ethics, which is another imaginary idea, right? I started asking the question to many, many people just to tell me times what they did when they didn't report, when they heard things that were difficult and they talked about harms. And you know what people said? You know what I did? I didn't report. I had a conversation. What I did is I started bringing groceries every week and I built trust. What I did is that I wasn't sure what was happening with the family. So I started talking to people. I started talking to neighbors. And instead of explaining, well, this is how you make a report. And this is, I know this is like an inevitable because your license requires you to report and my imagination is going to limit me on the inevitability of your licensure. I'm asking people to not do that, to resist, and also to shift relationship. Shift the construct of what it means to help, right? That is a relational change that we can do every day. And I can see it, I have seen it, and I can imagine it being bigger and better every day.
Yeah, I mean, Erin used to do family defense and I do it now. And in the state of Pennsylvania, I mean, my lawyer's office that I'm in today is one of the only safe places that a mother can come to report that she's in crisis. Pretty much anywhere else that she goes, she's going to be surrounded by mandated reporters. And I can't say anything better than Erin, but I do want to just flag for you a recent Mother Jones article. I think a lot of you were stars in that article that really told one mother's story about how she reached out to help to a domestic violence agency and the spiral that set off in her life because they were mandated reporters, the harm that was created by the act of mandated reporting itself.
Thank you all for those answers. I think we have time. We have just over 5 minutes left, so I'm going to put out one more question. We have one question in the chat saying, I hear the call to build new structures for safety for families like housing, food. That's not a replacement to family policing, but at the same time, I worry that the move to create systems outside of the state, not collaborating, can also become an excuse for the state to operate independently of the demands of traditionally marginalized communities. How do we balance political demands and control of the state with the refusal to collaborate?
I think it's a really good question. I think when we are imagining and we're visioning, we also have to understand there's always going to be opposition, pushback, and a period of retrenchment, right? That people are going to, as quickly as we vision, tell us that that vision is harmful and find different ways to kind of like reorganize themselves, because maintaining white supremacy is an order of the United States, of the global world, that is important to people. So while we're organizing for freedom, people are with more power and access to resources right now are also organizing to maintain their power. So it is important always to consider that that is going to happen moving forward, and not to, lose the discipline of hope and keep moving forward. And I don't think it's a matter of not collaborating. I think there's no co-governance, right? You can't, like, the idea of like who you collaborate with and who you co-govern with are two different ideas. Co-governance means like a sharing of power, a sharing of understanding. I actually am not sure there is a collaboration when there is a power dynamic. Like, I don't think you can collaborate with ACS. I think you could try to co-govern. I think that's a false idea. But I think the question might be one that's better answered with the idea, and I've heard other speakers in the prior panels with, what is an abolitionist step forward and what is a reform? So this could be another entire panel. I really encourage people to look up critical resistance and look up Abolition 101 and Miriam Kaba, and just an enormous amount of literature that's been written around. We accept as abolitionists that it's very unlikely that tomorrow the world is going to fundamentally transform. So how do I get from point A to Z and not pass through B, right? So there is a framework to analyze, is this step I'm taking to move the needle a little bit that may be kind of moving around the system, is it actually getting me towards abolition? Or is it doing that thing we talked about, is moving one piece of money from my checking to the savings, keeping me rich and not making anyone else richer? That's what we call reform. And so, without going through all the steps, I will say, I will put in the chat some resources. And I will also say we don't actually have all the answers on how to do that when it comes to abolishing the family regulation, the family destruction system. I would say that we're kind of in this winter of our movement, right? Where we're coming together on these ideas of abolition. I think we're going to have to collectively decide together, what are our principles of abolitionist steps? What do we need to analyze as we're moving forward? And I think if you have that question, I invite you to be in that conversation with us, right? Because it seems like whoever asked that question you're already thinking like, wow, this is gonna be really, really hard. What is the actual implementation method? And I would say, here's some resources, let's read them together, let's talk about it. And I think we're gonna start to create some plans together.
Yeah, I also think when we talk about defunding the police, I think there's different steps that we would have to take versus defunding the family regulation system, because the family regulation system, a lot of their money comes from foundations. So I want to tell foundations right now, stop supporting what you know is not working. Stop telling me that you're giving them 10 times the amount of money you're giving me because you're trying to fix the outcomes for children. If you want to fix the outcomes for children, stop funding them and let's start working together to prevent children from going into the system. That's how you fix the outcomes. You don't put them there in the first place. You don't send them through the process, terrify their life, set them up for failure, and then fix it on the end. Like, what is this thing that white people have with tearing people apart and then claiming to do God's work fixing them? Stop it, stop it, stop it. It doesn't make sense. There's plenty of people on this call who would love to share your funding with you. I, for one, raised my hand at first. I'm sure Movement for Family Powers could use a little funding. The legal work that Kathleen is doing, the research that Dr. Roberts is doing, there are better ways to spend your money to invest in change. And so we don't have to go through a whole process to get a foundation to stop giving money. When we talk about the police, we got to start talking about city and state funding and all this other stuff. Redledge, you don't have to give money to ACS. Casey, you don't have to give money to ACS. And the rest of you, you do not have to give money to ACS. You can begin to help us build out what is needed in the community.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize what Erin and Joyce were saying, and I told them to call me Dorothy. I just want you to know when we had a pre-call. But anyway, the idea of non-reformist abolitionist reforms that has been developed in prison abolition, I think is very useful. I agree, as Joyce said, that everything isn't perfectly transferable into this work, but I think that is a very useful principle that we are going to have to make incremental steps toward completely dismantling the family policing system and figure out what kinds of steps will actually push us toward abolition, as opposed to some that are just reformist and are going to hold us back. And so what is an abolitionist reform? I think we've talked about some of them that would involve legislation, like ending mandatory policing. I mean, reporting, well, policing too, but ending mandatory reporting, abolishing, we didn't mention this, but abolishing the Adoption Safe Families Act that speeds up termination of parental rights and gives incentives to put children in foster care into adoptive homes, increasing parent representation, family defense work like Kathleen's, and ending the ways in which financial exploitation of families in the system is permitted under law, including US Supreme Court cases. And then how can we channel all the money that comes from the federal government, state and local governments, and as Joyce has mentioned, foundations as well, into supporting community-based organizing for building a radically different way of meeting families' needs and crises, and treating everybody humanely instead of in this punitive, harmful way. So those are just some ideas, but as everyone's saying, we have to work together to figure out how to do it. But it is helpful to have some of these ideas that prison abolitionists have been developing for decades that we can learn from in our movement. And just let me say one more thing. Another important thing is to see the connections between these movements for Black Lives Matter, for prison abolition, for defunding police, and make sure we are coordinated and not in opposition to each other, which was happened. I don't want to make too big a deal about it, but there were some people calling for defunding police and putting that money into CPS, which if they understood that CPS is a carceral policing apparatus, just like law enforcement, and actually is law enforcement, they wouldn't have made those proposals.
Thank you all so much. We are a couple minutes over, so I'm going to wrap us up. We have one question in the chat: how can scholars and activists get involved? And I think these women have answered that question so beautifully for us. I've put in the chat all of their Twitter handles, lots of they all have great resources that you can read. And a lot of the other questions that are in the chat are directly answered by the work of these women. I just want to acknowledge that I and the 300 other people that have been on this call have so much to learn from the way that you all lift each other's work up. And I just want to state that you all do such a beautiful job of saying how hard you're working and then lifting up the other people in this space. And that is a huge thing that I'm taking away from today. And I hope that we can continue to lift up the voices of the people who have things to say in this conversation. And I think that is a great place for all of us to start, is by listening, by reading, by engaging with this work, by not being afraid to really reimagine the systems and the structures that are at play, and really push the limits of what our entire societal structure has imposed on us. And you all have really inspired me to do that. I have pinched myself every day the past few months just thinking that I get to be on a Zoom call with you all. So I'm just so grateful for your time. We have learned so much from you. You are just absolute fire. So thank you all so much. We look forward to continuing the conversation over the coming weeks and months and years. And thank you everyone for being here today. We will take a break for lunch, and then at 1:30, we will come back for a panel on abolishing ICE in the immigration system. So we look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank
Thanks,
you, guys. I love
Forever.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Lindsay
you.
for organizing us. This was great.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.